Welcome to Augustana, and welcome to this year's O Fritiof Lander Lecture in Immigration History. My name is Dag Blank, and I'm the director of the Swenson Center. This year, we mark the sesquicentennial of the two Augustanas, the college and the synod. It was 150 years ago this past summer when a group of Swedish and Norwegian immigrants met in Jefferson Prairie, Wisconsin, right on the state line between Wisconsin and Illinois. And that state line has moved, or the church where they met has moved across that state line. So in the older records it says Illinois, and the newer records it says Wisconsin. But we know where it is. They decided to establish both a church, the Augustana Synod, and a college and seminary to serve the needs of the rapidly growing waves of Swedish immigrants to the Midwest. The college opened its doors almost exactly 150 years ago in September of 1860, but in Chicago. During the coming month, we are marking the Swedish dimensions of the two Augustanas here at the Swenson Center in different ways. We begin tonight with our annual Ander lecture in immigration history. In 2 weeks' time, we turn our focus on modern Sweden and on contemporary film in our film festival and symposium called Beyond Bergman, Modern Swedish Film. We will show 5 modern Swedish films, one every night, Monday through Friday, beginning on October the 11th, and conclude with a one-day symposium on Saturday, October 16th, with film scholars from Sweden and the United States discussing these modern Swedish films that we have just seen during the preceding week. A variety of films will be shown, including the recently released The Girl with a Dragon Tattoo, based on the worldwide best-selling thriller by the same name, that you may have seen in your local borders. The film festival and the symposium are free of charge, and everyone is cordially invited. Come to one film, come to all, and come to the symposium. We have further information right here about the film festival, and you can register so that we know how much coffee to order. And you can also sign up for the lunch, which I think costs around $10, is it? Yeah, that's the only charge. If you want lunch, we need to tell the food service how many are coming. But so you can sign up here, or you can sign up through our website where this is advertised, or you can call Susanne Titus and sign up with her. So we cordially invite you to come to this film festival, Beyond Bergman, Modern Swedish Film, and really see 5 modern Swedish films. And many of them have not really been widely released in the United States, I don't think, have they, Larry? No. Some, but
they've been released, they haven't been seen.
They haven't been out at the cinemas in Davenport, have they? No. And we do this, of course, the Swenson Center does this in cooperation with the Scandinavian department. It's really the Scandinavian department that's arranging the big help out, because we believe that modern Sweden is also important, and modern Swedish film is important. So that's our second activity after the Ander lecture tonight. And our final activity, marking the Swedish dimension of the Augustana sesquicentennial, takes place not in Rock Island, but in Chicago at North Park University on November 5th to the 6th, where we, together with the Swedish American Historical Society, are co-arranging a conference on Swedish-American church history. So those of you who are interested in Swedish-American church history will want to be there. This deals more specifically with the relationship between the Augustana Synod and the Mission Covenant Church. And Phil Anderson is up there, yes, from the Swedish-American Historical Society, and from North Park are co-arrangers. You can find information about this conference here as well, and the program and the costs. And we're very happy to note that our own Tom Treadway will be giving the keynote address there on Friday nights. So you don't want to miss that either. Now, enough of commercials from coming events. Time to turn our attention to tonight's main attraction. As most of you know, for over 20 years, the Swenson Center has sponsored the annual O Fritiof Ander Lecture in Immigration History. It is held in memory of Fritiof Ander, professor of history at Augustana from 1930 to 1968, I believe, a legendary Augustana faculty member in his time. He was also a pioneer in the study of immigration history, in particular the history of Swedish immigration to the United States, a field to which he made many and important contributions. It is thus very fitting to have a lecture series in his name, and we are particularly happy that this has now entered into its 3rd decade, as tonight's presentation is the 21st Ander lecture. And that makes it the 3rd decade, doesn't it? speaker tonight is Dr. Henrik Williams, who is Professor of Scandinavian Languages at Uppsala University in Sweden, where he also holds a chair in the subject of Scandinavian languages, a chair which I believe is the oldest in Scandinavian languages in Sweden, beaten by a few months. Professor Williams' field of expertise is in historical linguistics, philology, and runology. He has written extensively on topics such as the history and interpretation of runes, dialectology, onomastics. Who knows what onomastics is? Raise a hand. Well, that is personal and place name, the study of names, onomastics. And also on the origins of alphabets. He has created the Scandinavian runic text database at Uppsala and currently heads a research project on the original version of the so-called Uppsala Edda, or the Codex Uppsaliensis. As a runologist, it seems difficult not to in some way address the topic of his lecture tonight, the so-called Kensington Runestone. That is the runestone that was discovered in 1898 in central Minnesota, and the controversy that has surrounded it ever since. And tonight, Henrik Williams, too, as a runologist, will address this issue. It's inevitable. You have to. You follow in the long line of other runologists. He is currently in the United States on a national lecture tour from Harvard in the east to UCLA in the west, talking about runes, runology, and the Kensington Stone. And we're very glad that he was able to squeeze in Rock Island, Illinois, in his busy schedule. It is a great honor to invite my colleague and good friend, Henrik Williams, to give the 2010 O. Fritiof Andrew Lecture in Immigration History, The Kensington Stone, Fact and Fiction. Please.
Thank you very much, Dag. In reality, it's not a question of squeezing something in. This is, at least for me, the climax of my tour. And I would say that I cannot say how honored I am to be invited to give this lecture, this memorial lecture. It's not on the happiest of days, however. I just been to the memorial service after Augustana personality Michael Nolan. I know that Mike was a friend of many, and I count myself as one of minor ones, but still. I know that he was looking forward to attending this lecture, and I wish to dedicate it to his memory. My interest in the Kensington Runestone actually started right here in 1988 when I bought a book by Hjalmar Holland in the Viking bookshop at Augustana. A bookshop, I should say, which at least had a frieze of runes. And I heard here from the president that it may have been painted out. Has anyone seen the runes recently? They're there. And I should like to point out that they're Old English, that is Anglo-Saxon runes, and have nothing to do with the Viking Age. I, on the other hand, had already at that time worked for a few years on the language on the rune stones in Sweden, and before I turn to the Kensington Runestone, I would like to remind you that it's not normally in America where we find runic monuments, in case you didn't know. And in order to judge the ones that we do find here, we have to compare them with the ones that are found in the runic heartland of Scandinavia. There we have over 6,000 inscriptions before the year 1500. And you have a table there so you can read up on that. I'm not going to go through it. Almost 60% of these are Swedish, about 25% of them from Norway, and another 15% from Denmark. But the age and the distribution of the inscriptions vary. In the earliest times, Denmark leads. In the Viking Age, Sweden dominates hugely. And in the Middle Ages, Norway has the upper hand. There are also a few Scandinavian inscriptions on the continent and some 300 or so on the Atlantic islands, Iceland, Greenland, including the British Islands, where you also find about 80 Anglo-Saxon inscriptions. They don't deserve to be in your bookstore. Most people who have seen any runic inscription at all is likely to have come across a Swedish runestone from the Viking Age. And no wonder, since these are so common and conspicuous. And I should point out that this wonderful device that I was given by Susanne Titus bears the name of Kensington. This, of course, is Sweden and Stockholm, so you know where we are. And you can just see the area with blue dots here. Every little dot represents a Viking Age runestone. The red dots you can see, some of them here and most of them there, are medieval inscriptions. Many of the runestones in Sweden stand on their original site in nature, adorned with a typical runic serpent whose body serves as a text band for the runes, such as this one, the Måsta stone, about 10 miles south of Uppsala. Even during the Viking Age, I must point out, most runestones were Christian, as you can see in this one. It's a cross and it also bears the prayer. And those prayers are very common, so are the crosses. So the church had nothing against runes. This is an important thing to remember. There are always exceptions, however, and the greatest runestone in the world, this one, is one of those. It's very early, around 800, and it mentions the god Thor. The Rökstone is more than 8 feet above ground and another 5 feet below ground to keep it steady. It's carved on all of its 5 surfaces, including the slanting top. It has 720 individual runic characters, and it weighs 5 metric tons. It is simply the queen of runestones. When the immigrants left Sweden, one might have thought that they also left all runestones behind. But no, that did not turn out to be the case. In the fall of 1898, the Swedish-American farmer Olof Öhman, or Olof Oman as he is usually called, was uprooting trees on a hillock near his farm, near the town, or I should say city, of Kensington, population of 286, in Douglas County, Minnesota, central Minnesota. This is a plan of the site where they found the inscription, and I believe actually they found it there, I think it is, and not where you find the arrow. That's where they think it should have been. I was just there. And according to Oman's own affidavit from 1909, he found clasped in the roots of an aspen tree a 200-pound stone slab, the Kensington Runestone, 2.5 foot high and more than a foot wide, covered with strange symbols. This is the Kensington stone. Its inscription describes a visit by a party of Scandinavians and is dated to 1362. And all of you have been given a handout with the most recent reading and translation of this stone. That is not the final one, however. Oman kept the stone for a few days, and then he left it to a local bank, from whence it was sent to Chicago for inspection. After a few months, it was returned to the finder, who kept it until 1907, when he sold it to Hjalmar Holland for a few bucks, and then Holland wrote extensively on it from 1908 until his death in 1963. In 1899, there was an examination of the stone by Professor George Kerm, but another professor, Olaus Breda, from Minneapolis, had already given a preliminary translation on the basis of a drawing. Breda and Kerm were unanimous in their result that the inscription on the Kensington Runestone was not medieval. This conclusion has, to my knowledge, been corroborated by every single academically trained scholar in Scandinavian, English, or German studies who've ever pronounced on the subject. 2 scholars, the Cornell linguistics professor Robert Hall and the Copenhagen professor of Arctic ethnology William Tholbetzer, have come out on the opposite side in favor of its medieval origin, and so has at least one geologist. But given this otherwise massive academic consensus among all the people who supposedly should know best, why is not the Kensington debate over? And what, if any, relevance does it have to today's Swedish-American community? I will try to answer these questions in reverse. In my introduction, you got to see at least one of the most fantastic runestones of Scandinavia, and hence the world, the Rökstone. It's a unique cultural heritage and constitutes for Sweden a high-profile phenomenon that never fails to impress tourists and Swedes alike. I should say non-politicians who never seem to be impressed by anything, especially not historical things. What would Sweden be without its Vikings and its runes? Now when Bjorn Borg and ABBA and the Swedish welfare model and even Swedish sin no longer make the headlines. Shall we be content that our fame is based on the untrue belief that Sweden is the suicide hotspot of the world. We still have our runic inscriptions, I guess, and that's what I've been doing this tour to promote. However, famous runes and runestones are, with over 4.5 million results if you do an internet search for the word runic alone, it is not one of the Scandinavian monuments that proves to be the most famous of them all, but rather the stone slab found in Kensington. Whereas an internet search for the Rökstone will give you 22,300 results, a search for the Kensington Runestone will yield exactly thrice as many. Hence, the latter monument is thrice as popular or famous as the Rökstone. And it is on permanent display at the Runestone Museum in Alexandria, Minnesota, since 1958, where it attracts many visitors. How many here have seen the Kensington Runestone? A few. The impression of the Kensington Runestone preeminence is also borne out by the exhibition of the stone from October 2003 to October 2004 at the Museum of National Antiquities in Stockholm. I should say that this and most other pictures have been stolen from the master's thesis by Adam Lutén, sitting over here. I don't usually acknowledge that, but since it's present. That's what we professors do. We just steal unpublished research. The museum had over 35,000 visitors in the months that the stone was on display, and that was an increase of 36% compared to the same period in the previous year. Since the museum also holds and exhibits a huge number, I would say, of Viking artifacts, including hundreds of Viking runestones, it's noteworthy that the regular exhibition had not attracted the same amount of visitors. It seems to me that if the Swedish-American community holds what may be called the world's most famous runestone, it ought to pay some attention to it. And this is indeed also done, if not by everyone, and not equally intensely during all times of its history. Most of the Scandinavian immigrants to the United States at the end of the 19th century were rather recent arrivals, many of them in the upper Midwest. As is well known, the Swedish Americans were in many cases neither quite Swedish nor quite American at first, and by that I mean that they identified themselves perhaps more regionally within Sweden than nationally before they immigrated, and that their status in the new land was not clear-cut. It has been stressed that the finding of the Kensington Runestone was too well timed to be quite fortuitous. In 1892, there was a World's Columbian exhibition opened in Chicago, which was visited by 25 million guests. 25. That's more than went to the big historic museum in Stockholm. And this exhibition celebrated the 400-year anniversary of Christopher Columbus's discovery of America, so-called discovery of America. And it had three full-scale replicas of the ships that he sailed. But the Scandinavians were not to be outdone. The Norwegians actually sailed a real-life replica of a Viking ship from Norway all the way to Chicago. At least that is what Dag claims. I don't think they did sail all the way up. I think they were being towed for a while there. And thereby, they showed that the stories in the Icelandic sagas of Old Norse settlement on the American continent were credible. More than half a century before this was proven to be true by the find of the Viking settlement in Lands of Meadows. But such proof wasn't available in the 1890s, and that was a lack that was rectified by finding the Kensington Runestone, which of course proved that, Norsemen were there decades before Columbus. Ivar Kjær, the Danish, who's written about the Chicago Exposition, he ends his article, and I quote, "The Kensington Runestone is not an important fake, but a central identity-bearing symbol in the history of Nordic American immigration," end of quote. But of course he may be overstating the case. We must also bear in mind that the Scandinavian American immigrants were not alone. Not only did they have to compete with the Italian Americans and their claim that Columbus was there first of the Europeans, there were also plenty of German, and even more native English-speaking speakers who had been in America much longer than the Scandinavians had, and therefore had a much higher status. The Kensington Runestone established once and for all, at least for some people, that Swedes and Norwegians were here first. Well, that of course is a partial truth at best. The Native Americans were here first of all, even before 1362. It's interesting to see how the original settlers of the American continent are viewed through the Kensington Runestone debate. At first, the inscriptions mentioning of 10 men red with blood and dead, if you look at your handouts, you will find that on lines 7 and 8. 10 men red with blood and dead. That was taken as proof of hostile Indians. This is from a wonderful little magazine put out in the beginning of the 60s. And, well, you can see right there what they were doing. And Hjalmar Holand, in one of his books, writes, and I quote, "Presumably these men had been suddenly overwhelmed, killed and scalped by a party of Indians, and the blood from their riven heads had flowed down and covered their features. The returning fishermen had been horrified by such a gory manner of mutilating the dead." End of quote. Note the word suddenly and the presumptions of a horrible scalping act. This is what he, I presume, was envisioning when he thought about this line in the inscription. Now, it doesn't say anything about Indians, does it? And in fact, the opposite attitude has reasonably been perhaps the most popular, and it may be exemplified by a book from 2001 by Thomas Ryersgård, one of the Kensington enthusiast authors. He believes that the bloody casualties were caused by the Black Death, which was a pulmonary bubonic plague that wiped out a huge portion of Europeans in the middle of the 14th century. And far from an Indian massacre, he thinks that Native Americans were themselves victims to this epidemic, which eventually led to the loss of their land to the Europeans. So again, the Kensington Party would have affected American history. I would say that the Kensington Runestone remains an icon of Swedish Americanism in some circles, and in certain cases violently so, as shown by the presumably Swedish Texan who lambasted the Kensington Runestone skeptic Erik Wahlgren in 1958 for this quote: "How one of your nationality can fight the honor of being this country's discoverer is beyond me. Are you paid by the Knights of Columbus?" To most Swedish Americans, however, the Kensington Runestone plays little or no role, and when it does, it's a symbol among many other. And this part of the lecture I've stolen from Adam Call, who should be sitting up there, and also has now published his master's thesis. When they don't do this, you know, Is the Kensington Runestone no longer a Swedish-American concern as much as one for the Runestone Museum and the Alexandrian community? Yesterday, I lectured in Alexandria, and there was a crowd of over 250 people with a senior college listening to me. Very nice people. First, they had a hand count of how many believers were there in the public, and we're not talking Lutherans or Catholics here. Almost everyone raised their hand, including one heckler, I should say. In my opinion, the Swedish American community has every reason to stay concerned about the Kensington Runestone, not only, again, because of its fame. For better or for worse, it's part of this immigrant society, no matter how ancestral. And we always have to deal with our past, no matter what that is. I would also claim that whatever the history of the Kensington Runestone before 1898, its primary importance is as a contemporary object with a history richer than most. All the Kensington Runestone facts and all the fiction blend to make an exquisite combination of, it makes the stone a cultural icon, I should say, and perhaps the foremost among similar phenomena. I don't know if you could mention anything that quite compares to the Kensington Runestone. No? See? Its disputed authenticity only serves to make it more interesting and more symbolic. The question is only whether this icon will be the concern for merely commercial and special interests or not. I would personally that it became the catalyst for a discussion on several levels. For example, of how we used ethnic symbols and to what ends, of how academics and other people have interacted when debating the authenticity of the Kensington Runestone and the place for it in our history, and how this interaction should ideally have been. I will now return to the question of Kensington Runestone, fact and fiction. You might say that the monument had 3 ups and 2 downs. The first up, of course, was what it was found, and the first down when the more or less unified academic community in the following decade declared it to be modern. Holden's publications, that set off the second up, and it culminated with the exhibition of the Kensington Runestone at the Smithsonian in 1948-49. This is Smithsonian, which also supported the authenticity, I should say. However, this exhibition sparked 4 leading runologists of the day to speak out against the authenticity of the Kensington Runestone. And that was possibly the reason why the Smithsonian became more cautious while exhibiting the Kensington Runestone copy until 1954. And the final nail in the coffin, some considered Eric Walgren's 1958 book, The Kensington Runestone, the Kensington Stone, A Mystery Solved. And that I would call the second down. The Runestone Museum was established, strange enough, the same year, 1958, permanently exhibiting that stone. And the Minnesota Pavilion at the World Fair in New York changed its name from Minnesota Brainpower Builds Profits, I don't understand why that didn't pull huge crowds, to, in 1965, Minnesota, Birthplace of America. All of this still stolen from all of them, in Swedish money. I should have shown you the comparison, because it originally said Minnesota, and when they took this back to Alexandria, they changed the name. I don't think that was very nice. And I would call this guy, he's called Big Oldie, I would call him Oldie the Liar. This exhibition in 1965 prominently featured the Kensington Runestone. It made it very popular, yet without affecting scholarly opinion, I would say. For decades, nothing important happened, really, until Richard Nielsen enters the scene with a storm flood of writings on the language and runes of the stone in the 1980s, inspiring some geological and historiographical efforts too. Now, I've read a great deal of the literature on the Kensington Runestone, and it strikes me how partial almost all of it is. Not just the lay proponents of the medieval origin, but also the scholarly critics. No one seems really that interested in finding out the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. The facts are these. In spite of claims, even from the beginning, no evidence of any kind has ever surfaced that suggests that the finder of the stone, Olof Ullman, is the author of its inscription. There has been a rumor of a deathbed confession by a neighbor who claimed to have cooperated with Ullman, but it doesn't stand up to scrutiny. My brother is a criminal police, and he says no court would convict him. Nor has the fine history of the stone been proven false, although we have to rely on statements of those involved only. There is no archaeological or other tangible evidence proving that the Kensington Runestone was found in the claimed location or circumstances, nor any disproving it either, for that matter. Historical arguments have raged on the possibility of a 14th century journey from Scandinavia to Minnesota, but I would say that nothing is proven either way. Nor is the geological question solved. The first geologist working on the stone, Newton Winchell, he found the inscription to be old, and to some, this has been seen as vital. It is, however, diminished to some degree by the recent information that Winchell also authenticated supposedly Stone Age tools from the Kansas Valley that are obvious fakes. He was wrong then, he could have been wrong here. Recent geological work on the Kensington Runestone has reiterated Winchell's results, but they haven't been scientifically published and have had no scientific support, contrary to what you might have heard, I should have. But all scientific study on the stone properly conducted should be encouraged, and the most recent contribution of great value is a 3-dimensional documentation of the stone surface carried out under the species of Richard Nielsen. The fact remains that the only way of ascertaining the age of the Kensington Runestone text is by studying its language and its runes. And what may come as a surprise to some, the basis for this study has changed a great deal, in some ways even drastically, since around 1950, when most of the runologists proclaimed the Kensington Runestone to be modern. It's easy if you look at your paper to see that the Kensington language looks more like 19th century Swedish, possibly with some Norwegian elements, than any of the old Scandinavian dialects. The problem here is that you need to know both modern and old Scandinavian. How many of you do that? Not so many. Hence, you have to trust the authorities, who then better be right. Because, and I could do a little lecture on trust here. You know, trust is like virginity. It's very hard to get it back. And I'm sorry to say, not all of my predecessors in the field have always been absolutely correct. There's a second problem. It's a fact that earlier Scandinavian scholars knew the old language mainly from handbooks and published literary texts and legal texts, such as laws. But the language on the Kensington Runestone is most likely not so classical and is better compared with the text that we know as charters or deeds, medieval letters mostly dealing with the sale of real estate and other transactions. And these have been very little investigated, and it doesn't help that the old Swedish charters after 1355, the time when 1362, when the Runestone claims it's from, these charters weren't even published until the 1970s. Hjalmar Holland, he tried to use the material published in his time, and he did find some interesting forms, but it wasn't until this Richard Nielsen that I mentioned several times went through the then published charters from 1355 to 1375 that someone really struck gold. In spite of earlier claims, old Scandinavian words can indeed, with some important exceptions, look reasonably like what you find on the Kensington Runestone. You only have to pick forms from all over the Scandinavian area, and sometimes select rare forms occurring in one or a few of the tens of thousands of documents that we're talking about. And if I may quote myself, it's a fact that most of Nielsen's suggested parallels turned out not to be valid, but the ones that did show that it's not as easy to disprove the medieval origin of the Kensington Runestone as academic scholars have claimed. In fact, only a few lexical items may be judged impossible, and they are nicely balanced by the few that are likewise very hard to give a 19th century explanation. The question is no longer if the medieval origin of the Kensington Runestone inscription is possible, but rather if it's probable or not. This is the all-important distinction. Possible or probable. To make the Kensington Runestone medieval, you would have to expect a certain number of very unusual or even unique traits. Let us mention just one problem. We have this word, which looks a lot like modern Danish "opdagelsefald," excuse my Danish pronunciation, which means journey of discovery. And it has been used as one of the strongest arguments that the stone cannot be medieval, since there is no such word in Old Scandinavian, and the whole concept is probably more modern. But as always, there is usually a way around this. This rune is used for D in the inscription, but there isn't any word starting with a T, and it is possible that you could use this rune for words starting with a T. And then you can have the equivalent of an old Swedish upptakelsefärd, which would literally mean up-taking journey, but probably the clearing of land, the journey to clear land or take land in possession. We do have the verb in Old Swedish, upptaka, which is this meaning. And there is also a noun, upptakelse, which doesn't mean uptaking of land, it has another meaning, but it could be that we just haven't had that recorded. And there is no word upptakelsefärd, but färd is a very common second element in Old Swedish words, and why couldn't it be combined with this one, as well as others. So, and there are other problems here why we have this instead of that, but that can also be explained. So yes, it is possible to hypothesize the existence of the Old Swedish word upptakelsefärg, but you have to ask yourself, is it probable? If you think the problem I've just presented is complex, remember it's only one word out of 65 on the stone. Almost everyone beset with problems and in need of very detailed and technical discussion. In this case, a single word contains a multitude of separate complications dealing with runes, sounds, meaning, and word composition. It's impossible for me to go into full discussion here, and I'm not quite sure would wish me to. Linguistics is fascinating, but complicated. Suffice it to say that no single word absolutely proves that the Kensington Runestone cannot be medieval. Let me put this quite clearly. There is no smoking gun. The text, however, as most of you know, doesn't consist of a collection of words. It's an organic whole. It is the representation of a language, of a genre, of a situation. When you sit down to write a letter, you don't mix all the languages you happen to know and all the genres. The text has a context. And in my best judgment as an expert in the field, I cannot find that the Kensington Runestone inscription looks like any medieval Scandinavian text I have ever seen. And this, of course, is the reason why all philologists simply have great problem in accepting it. But if it's not medieval, it has to be 19th century. It can't be in between. And most of the words certainly look to belong to that century rather than to the 14th. There are exceptions, however, and among these, which are extremely difficult or even impossible to reconcile with the 19th century Swedish or Norwegian, are these. The first two, of and Lise, are still problems. Everyone always claims that this of it's in line 3, Vinland of West. Now it doesn't make any sense in modern Swedish. It doesn't make any sense in Old Swedish. It doesn't make any sense in English. People always claim that this is an English word that is being used on the stone. If you used one or two English words when you're writing Swedish, would this be the word you would choose? I just have to admit that I haven't gotten a good explanation for this. The other word, this one, it's not medieval, it's not modern. It's actually 16th century, but only twice done, and it just stands out. However, these three words are definitely, at least those two, they must be medieval. This word does not exist with this P spelling in any Scandinavian dialect. So that is certain proof that this is a medieval word. If you presume a forger of this document, you have to show how these medieval words made their way to Minnesota in the 1890s. And I don't think that you're allowed to presume that the forger was, a professor of linguistics or had the access to a wonderful library with old Swedish dictionaries and stuff. I don't think that's what Minnesota usually had in those days. So you have to give it a simple solution. That's always what we should be looking for. And in fact, there is indeed a book with the necessary information in this case. It's an 808-page dictionary, encyclopedia by a man called Carl Rosander with a wonderful title of Den kunskapsrika skolmästaren, the knowledgeable schoolmaster. The second edition of this was published in 1882, and if you were in Minnesota in the 1890s, you could get hold of this book. How do I know that? Olaf Ullman himself owned a copy dated 1891. I'm not saying he carved the stone. I just say if he had the book, so could other people. The words "ekte" and "mans" that I just showed you appear on page 62 on the lines next to each other with virtually the same spelling. And the Lord's Prayer ending in "deliver us from evil," of course in English, ending in "frälse oss av illo," this word "illo," that it cannot be modern Swedish. It is found on page 74 It is there dated to the year 1300. I have to say that I find it indicative that we find exactly those three words, which look like pure Old Scandinavian, in the Kensington Runestone, also in one and the same book, within a couple of pages of each other, under a section entitled The History of the Swedish Language. I've tried to show you, however, that the evidence against the medieval origin of the Kensington Runestone inscription is not as clear-cut as some believe linguistically. The weight of the evidence still supports a 19th century origin, but many of the supposedly impossible words and forms have been shown to exist or to be at least possible in Old Swedish. Even though the case for a 14th century origin still leaves much to be desired, I should also want to point out that the case for the 19th century origin is not complete. We need to turn to the roots. If the linguistic situation has changed a lot in the 60 years, it's nothing compared to the runological. This is where the proponents of the medieval origin of the Kensington have had their strongest arguments, at least in my opinion, and I am a runologist. The runes on the stone are, to be sure, quite different from those found from other times and places. But if the Kensington Runestone is a forgery, the proponents argue, why didn't the forger simply borrow the runes from some easily obtainable source? Such as, for example, Rosander. On page 61, he has a Viking Age rune roll. The established runologists, they have claimed that this forger independently invented a completely new runic set, which was possibly influenced by some late Doric-Carnian runes, which they have some small similarities. We now have a solution, a dramatic solution to this problem, to which I will return, but that was the problem back then, and that was the problem when I started studying this. Why would someone use these strange runes that no one else had ever seen when there was a perfectly good rune roll available to anybody? The second weakness on the arguments of the earlier runologists was the lack of runic material from the late 14th century with which to compare it to the Kensington Runestone. The ubiquitous runestones from the Viking Age, 2,500 of them, with which most of them, and I at that time, were well acquainted, they say nothing about the Kensington Runestone, right? They cannot say anything about runic practices in the 1360s. And the material from about that time that did actually exist 100 years ago was often badly published or even worse known. And even so, we could start by looking at this material to see if the Kensington Runestone inscription looks at all like contemporaneous examples in Scandinavia. The answer is no. And this is especially interesting when comparing with one of the richest find spots of the 14th century runic inscriptions on stone, that is the Baltic island of Gotland, which has as many as 90, 70 of which are grave slabs in churches. And Gotland, remember all the little red dots on that island that I pointed out on the map, has repeatedly named the starting place for the Kensington Runestone expedition. And one writer, Scott Walter, even claims in his 2009 book called The Hooked X, about the Holy Grail in America, I quote, "Numerous linguistic, runic, grammatical, and dialect traits found in the Kensington Runestone inscription are also found in medieval runic inscriptions on Gotland. Interpretation, the carver of the Kensington Runestone was likely educated in these aspects in the Old Swedish language on the island of Gotland." End of quote. Actually, I can prove that the Kensington Runestone was not carved by anyone from Gotland, since the inscription itself tells us so. The belief of Scott Walter is obviously that the 8 Goths mentioned in the inscription on the first line of the inscription means Gotlanders, but it doesn't. As anyone who knows any Swedish could tell him, the word on the Kensington Runestone, Göte, signifies people from Götaland, which is the southern part of continental Sweden. The word for people from Gotland would have been Gute in this dialect, and would have been spelled like that. Thus, it should come as no surprise to you that nothing in the Kensington Runestone points specifically to Gotland in spite of his claims, and if we compare this inscription with one contemporary typical inscription from that island, the grave slab of Grötlingo, which looks like this and has the inscription meaning that. We find that none of the special runes on the Kensington Runestone have any correspondence on this Götigel stone. These three runes, the A rune, the K rune, and the U rune, look like that on this, where everything was supposed to look the same. And on Gotland at this time, there's a special Gotlandic S rune. It looks like this. The S rune on the Kensington Runestone looks like that. Nor does the language tally, I should say. On Gotland, there's a diphthong, that's the vowel in the word stone. It's actually the area in Scandinavia where this diphthong is maintained the longest. And on the Kensington Runestone, it's spelled sten, just like in modern Swedish. And I should say, in Old Swedish for that matter, but it proves that the Kensington Runestone did not come from Gotland. And their case endings on the Gotlandic stone, there is nothing like that on the Kensington Runestone. And some words ending with the vowel A, that is maintained still in this stone, whereas on the Kensington stone you have a weakening to E. Now this is fairly common in some Swedish dialects, and some Norwegian too, for that matter. And it was actually excellent in Old Swedish too. The interesting thing is that Olof Oman did not speak a dialect that has this dialect feature. This actually points away from him, personally. Someone might object that it's hardly fair to compare a lying down grave marker from a church to an erected memorial left by an expedition in trouble, thousands of miles from home. And the problem is that there is simply very little to compare with. I have found a single standing runestone that might be from the 14th century in Scandinavia. It is this from Norway, the Eggestone. And as you can see, its inscription, it's a border marker, and I could just summarize this, that there's nothing on this runestone that point towards the Kensington Runestone. I just want to point out one fact. On all the stones I've showed you so far, you have personal names, right? That is something that is conspicuously missing on the Kensington Runestone. Richard Nielsen jokingly says that the word Norman is really the personal name Norman, and they were all called Norman, the 22 of them. Even he doesn't mean that. But, I'm not saying it's proving anything, but it's, suspicious, because of the 6,000 inscriptions that I know, I've never seen a longer inscription that doesn't contain personal names. I mean, that was the whole reason they had them in the first place, right? It's like putting in an obituary without naming the person who died. Okay, so we got to go somewhere close to America to find runes. Where's that? Well, Greenland is the closest place where you actually do find inscriptions that you're absolutely certain are genuine. And this is a wonderful little object, unfortunately a poor picture of the Kingitorswak stone. It's actually a stone shard about this big, hidden in a cairn in northern Greenland. Again, there is nothing here that connects it to the Kensington Runestone. No special rune forms, nothing in the language. On the other hand, there are no Greenlanders mentioned in the Kensington Party, if there ever was one, and the great majority of those, they were Norwegian. And the inscription itself is very informal, as you can say, and perhaps we shouldn't compare it with Swedish runestones or grave markers at all. And at the time, in 1950, when they tried to do that, there was nothing to compare it with. But in 1955, the harbors, or I should say the harbor houses in Bergen, in Norway, burned down. And it revealed the medieval harbor in many layers, because that part of town had burned down many times, and each layer was like half a meter thick, so it was 3 or 4 meters of cultural layers. And these were filled with various items, especially very wooden artifacts that have been beautifully preserved. And as many as 600 of those bore runic inscriptions. A complete, simply wonderful material, giving us a glimpse of everyday life in medieval Bergen. And I'm just showing you one. It's difficult to give you pictures, so you can see here a drawing, and you can see it's a letter from a husband to his wife, dealing with some very mundane matters. There are 130 medieval inscriptions from Bergen alone, Norway, that may stem from the 14th century. In none of them are there any specific ties to the Kensington Runestone. And I'm just showing you this one. I will send out another one. I stole this one when I visited the Bergen Museum. It's my favorite. On the front it says Gya, which is a woman's name. It says that you should go home. And on the back, I think there's an attempt or a response. It's just gibberish. You got something to amuse yourself with. And I should also add that these runic inscriptions, they really encompass the entire field of human experience. There is wonderful Latin love poetry, quotes from Virgil, love conquers all, let us all yield to love. In Latin, mind you, with runes. To the most explicit smut you could ever imagine. But I'm not even allowed to show here, I suppose. If you're interested, I can show you afterwards. As had been seen, there are no counterparts to the Kensington Runestone language and runic usage in contemporary Scandinavian inscriptions. And this has to some extent also been accepted by the proponents, but then their argument shifts to that the Kensington Runestone is the product of a learned author versed in Roman scribal practices, but in this case writing with runes. You can't rule that out. You know, anything is possible. It makes it very difficult for us to disprove. But by fantastic chance, incredible chance, we actually do have an example of what it looked like when a person with book learning in the mid-14th century chose to write runes. That is, the manuscript of the provincial law of Skåne, south of Sweden, which has, this is a copy of the old Danish law. And the runes are again exactly what we would expect from the time and the place, and nothing specific connected with the practices on the Kensington Runestone. You know, just the layout does in fact remind us a little bit of what the Kensington Runestone looks like. More like a book page, right? But if you study the runes, there's no system here that reminds us of the Kensington system. Thus, it seems that this stone stands totally alone in the context of other 14th century runic artifacts of Scandinavian origin. It then remains to be seen if the 19th century runic context would fit better. Until recently, this was definitely not the case. The Kensington runes deviated as much from the runes known in the 19th century in authentic or known from books, as they do from medieval runes. But in 2004, a sensational find was made at the Institute for Dialectology, Onomastics and Folklore Research in Umeå. It changed everything, I would say. 2 sheets of paper were found. The sheet dated to 1885, written by the Dalecarlian tailor Edward Larson. That's a copy of the 1883 sheet by his senior brother called Emil Larson. This older document first lists upper and lower case letters of the old style alphabet being phased out in Sweden at the end of the 19th century, German influenced. And then you have medieval runes right here. And then follows, it says here, for unknown reasons, this thing changed into this. Here is a rune roll that looks very interesting. Carl Emil writes this, when the style became more known, a complete alphabet arose, which for unknown reasons changes to the following appearance. And this is what you just saw. And finally, we have here what is called a secret style. These are called box code letters. It's not uncommon code. It's well known from later times. It's used by journeymen and others to communicate with their traveling fellows. You know, if you were traveling from farm to farm or from master to master to learn your trade, it'd be good to be able to communicate with people following you how things were. And the hobos did the same. They would put a little symbol saying, you know, angry dog here. The housewife is nice here. It gives you good food. They force you to work for your food, stuff like that. And this presumably had the same purpose. They indicate that these runes too were used in that province of Dalecarlia in the 19th century, possibly earlier. The Larson papers are indisputable proof that a Kensington type in runes were known in 1883. That is before the stone was discovered. You can understand how important this is. And this also explains why no one had heard of them. Where they weren't published in a single book anywhere. It was contained to a small group of initiates who probably had the provincial origin of Dalarna. And again, Olof Ullman came from Hälsingland, had nothing to do with Dalarna. Allow me to summarize. The Kensington Runestone inscription looks like no other Old Scandinavian text we know of, but no single word proves absolutely that it could not have existed in this form in the Middle Ages. The runic artifact as such has no parallels in the Old World and does not as a whole conform to what we know about medieval runic practices. The runes themselves incorporate some very unexpected and deviant forms that have no parallel in medieval runic inscriptions. But they do appear on a farm implement from 1907 that I have showed you, and in two documents from the 1880s. Excuse me. There is the farm implement. And in two documents from the 1880s with ties to the Swedish province of Dalecarlia. And the conclusion nearest at hand is that the Kensington Runestone was carved by a person or person in modern times. Having said this, why do I not plainly say that I believe the Kensington Runestone to be a fake? A question I had about 100 times from Bob. I have often been asked this question privately by a certain person, and I would like to respond to it publicly. First of all, the words believe and fake are not scholarly terms. Scholars establish the evidence and what conclusion it indicates. In this case, that evidence supports the conclusion that the Kensington Runestone is a 19th century inscription. Secondly, a fake is something done with the intention to deceive. There are plenty of runestones in Scandinavia carved in the recent centuries which cannot be called fakes, because they were just carved for fun or whatever. And as for the Kensington Runestone, we don't know what the intention of the carver was originally. Thirdly, the issue is so much more complex than just a question of fake or not. Almost everyone who sees the Kensington Runestone as a fake will automatically also claim that it's worthless. My attitude is exactly the opposite. There are genuine elements in the inscription. The greatest value is the use of the Larson type runes, which are genuine in the meaning non-learned. But also the language is of interest to an historian of Scandinavian languages, even though it is not as old as the inscription declares, but at least 112 years old. More important, however, is that the runestone itself is an effective catalyst of scientific debate. I myself have derived enormous use and profit and pleasure out of this stone. It made me a much better runologist and I hope a better scholar. It just simply forced me to learn lots of stuff I didn't know before in order to be able to enter into the debate. But it also contains questions like, how do we tell what is true or false? We're now trying to work out systems to date stone. That's great. How do we convey our scientific result to non-academics? What role does an object of this kind play as a symbol of an instrument in creating identity? And what can we learn about the use and abuse of historical objects? All important questions vital to answer if we as scholars wish to maintain our relevance and credibility. The Kensington Runestone brings these questions to the front and center, and as such, it's truly worthy of continued study. Thank you.